Racist police officers stopped a car and mocked the driver, confident they could do whatever they wanted. But the next morning, they were stunned to discover that the man was the new police chief. The night stretched on endlessly as Anthony Carter's car glided down the empty highway. The gentle moonlight spread across the narrow asphalt, merging with the glow from the headlights, occasionally illuminating road signs or the leaning trees along the roadside. The steady hum of the engine was Anthony's only companion, yet it couldn't calm the stream of thoughts rushing through his mind. His fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel, not from anxiety but from anticipation. In just a few hours, he would officially take on the role of police chief in a new town, a position that was both an opportunity and a responsibility. Anthony knew that the small town he was heading to wasn't just any job. He had read the reports carefully, gaining an understanding of the police department's reputation there. It was a place still steeped in conservative beliefs, known for its resistance to change, and where, beneath the surface, there lingered undertones of racial prejudice. However, Anthony had never shied away from difficult tasks. He knew this job would test him in ways few others had before. The straight road stretched endlessly like a ribbon, leading through dark forests and small farms. Occasionally, the distant lights from a house appeared as a faint dot on the edge of a field. Out of habit, Anthony adjusted his rearview mirror, though he knew no car was trailing behind him. The jazz music from the car speakers was a small comfort he allowed himself on this journey. It had been a long time since he'd felt the need to prepare so thoroughly for a new role. Anthony had experienced police departments where his abilities were questioned from the start, where his skin color stood out more than his identity and accomplishments. In the early days of his career, those moments made him frustrated and angry. But over time, he had learned to control that anger, turning it into inner strength and patience. His father's words echoed in his mind, "You'll achieve what you want, but stay calm like ice in difficult times." His father, a retired sergeant, understood well the battles that came with wearing a badge as a black man. Now, Anthony was ready to face those challenges once again. He had left a good position in the city, where he had earned respect that hadn't come easily. But now he was moving toward an uncertain future, a small police department where people didn't expect his arrival, but where he was determined to make a difference. Not by force, not by creating enemies, but with perseverance, strategy, and leadership. However, he wasn't naive. He knew his presence would stir up hidden conflicts for some people, opposition that wouldn't be overt but would manifest in subtle ways, through snide remarks or sabotage. Anthony quickly brushed away the brief discomfort that crossed his mind. He wasn't here to complain. The job was there to be done, and self-pity would get him nowhere. Anthony continued driving, his headlights illuminating the dark and empty road. Less than an hour remained until he reached the town, but the silence of the late night was suddenly shattered by the blinding red and blue flashing lights in his rearview mirror, along with the piercing sound of a siren echoing in the air. Anthony frowned, signaled, and pulled his car over to the roadside, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He knew exactly where this could lead. Anthony's car stopped at the roadside, the tires crunching on the gravel, breaking the silence with a harsh grating sound. Through his rearview mirror, he watched two police officers step out of the patrol car behind him. The first, a tall, muscular man with a crew cut, approached Anthony's window, while the other, appearing younger, with a smirk on his face, circled to the back of Anthony's car, his eyes scrutinizing. Anthony slowly rolled down his window, his gaze calm. The first officer stood by his window, tapping lightly on the glass with a gloved hand, looking down at Anthony with cold eyes and a smirk of challenge. "License and registration," the tall man ordered, his voice authoritative but laced with derision. Silently, Anthony handed over his documents, maintaining his composure. The officer took them, glancing over them with disinterest but never taking his eyes off Anthony. After skimming the papers, he looked Anthony over, a mocking smile creeping onto his face. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he asked, his tone suggestive. "This car doesn't look like the kind someone like you would own. Did you get lucky to have it?" Anthony took a deep breath, keeping his tone steady. "I'm on my way to work in town, officer. Is there a problem?" The second officer, named Derek, standing on the other side of the car, scoffed and approached the window, looking Anthony up and down with a derisive smile. "Working? Here, in this car? Must be a very special job, huh?" Anthony kept his eyes forward, his face expressionless. He knew the game they were trying to play, a game he'd grown all too familiar with throughout his career. He had learned to master his emotions, never letting them gain the satisfaction of anger or loss of composure. The first officer, named Ron, moved even closer to Anthony's window, a look of mockery clearly in his eyes. "So you say you're here for work, huh? I'm really curious about what kind of work that would be. If someone like you's coming here to work, we ought to know about it, don't you think?" Anthony remained unmoved, his gaze steady. "You'll find out soon enough." Derek, standing on the other side, let out a loud laugh, his voice echoing through the quiet night. "Oh, listen to him, Ron. Sounds like we're talking to a real mystery man here. Maybe he's some sort of secret agent or something, huh?" Ron raised an eyebrow, never taking his eyes off Anthony. "If you were somebody important, I'm sure we would have known by now." He then turned to Derek with a smirk. "But we should double-check, shouldn't we?" Derek nodded, his face full of mockery. "Definitely. But first, I think we should have a little fun, right, Ron?" Ron turned back to Anthony, a mocking smile on his face. "Step out of the car, Mr. Mysterious Driver." Anthony knew the situation could escalate if he didn't cooperate, so he slowly opened the door and stepped out. His shoes crunched on the gravel. When he stood up, he was slightly taller than Ron, but his expression remained calm, showing no signs of discomfort. However, he was fully aware they were trying to provoke him, and he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Derek circled Anthony's car, his eyes scanning each detail as if looking for something suspicious. "Nice car," he said with a sneering tone, his gaze examining every inch. "Not bad for someone just passing through." Anthony stayed silent, his eyes fixed forward, ignoring Derek's provocation. Ron moved closer, his eyes fixed on Anthony with a smug expression. "So, you're here for some special job, huh? I'm curious to know what kind of work would have you driving here at this time of night." Anthony kept his gaze steady, his voice calm but firm. "I'm a police officer," he said, "and as of tomorrow, I'll be your new police chief." A flicker of shock crossed Ron's eyes, his mocking smile fading, replaced by a hint of confusion. But he quickly recovered, laughing dismissively. Derek, standing beside him, burst out laughing as if Anthony had just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "A police chief? You're kidding, right?" Derek laughed so hard he doubled over, his mocking laughter loud and derisive, clearly believing this to be a joke. For a moment, he felt completely in control of the situation. But as his eyes returned to Anthony's face, the laughter began to fade. Anthony remained unresponsive, his face maintaining a calm, icy composure. He simply stood there, still holding the papers that Ron had snatched, his gaze unwavering and strangely serene. His emotions felt like a calm river, undisturbed, causing the atmosphere around him to grow tense. This demeanor was enough to spark a sense of unease within Derek and Ron. A heavy silence settled, as if Anthony had just entered the scene with a secret that was beyond comprehension. Ron glared at Anthony, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and irritation. He moved even closer, his voice laced with resentment. "Stop joking. If you're our new chief, we would have known by now." His voice carried a slight tremor, though he tried to maintain a menacing expression. Deep down, he disliked how Anthony stood there so calmly, confident, as though everything was under his control. Anthony gave a faint smile, his gaze never leaving Ron's face. "You'll know the truth by morning," he replied, his voice steady, neither loud nor soft, but carrying an invisible strength. "But now, may I go?" Without waiting for a response, his eyes shifted away, as if Derek and Ron were mere shadows, insignificant and unworthy of attention. Derek glanced at Ron, a look of confusion in his eyes, a hint of doubt surfacing in his gaze. Both men felt unsettled by Anthony's strange calm. They couldn't understand how a stranger could make them feel so off balance. For a moment, Derek began to wonder if they had overlooked something important. The feeling of unease bruised his pride, but also heightened his alertness. Ron continued to stare at Anthony, his eyes filled with anger. His mind raced with the possibility that Anthony might be telling the truth. If he was the new chief, it meant Ron's power and influence in the town would be challenged, even threatened. He felt himself losing control, and the thought drove him nearly mad. Finally, unable to contain his frustration any longer, Ron shoved Anthony's papers back at him, trying to mask his unease with a threatening tone. "Get going, but don't let us catch you speeding again, or you'll face more trouble than a simple stop." Anthony took his papers without a word and returned to his car. He knew the game they were trying to play, and he wouldn't let them win. Before driving away, Anthony discreetly checked his phone, making sure the entire conversation had been recorded. A precaution he had prepared for any situation that might arise. The taunts, the disdain, all of it was captured clearly. He started his car, the headlights once again lighting the road ahead, while the red and blue patrol lights faded into the background. Anthony continued toward the town, knowing this encounter was merely a prelude to the tougher challenges awaiting him. But he was ready. He wouldn't let people like Ron and Derek hinder his mission to bring justice and change to this place. The next morning, Anthony arrived at the police station in a crisp new uniform, his police chief badge gleaming on his chest. As he entered, sunlight streamed through the large glass entrance, enveloping him in a radiant glow that caught the attention of everyone in the room. Officers who had been chatting and greeting each other fell silent as he stepped in. A desk officer, looking slightly flustered, stood up and greeted him with a stammer. "Good morning, Chief. I'm Wilson. It's a pleasure to meet you." Anthony gave a slight nod and a smile in response, then cast his gaze around the room. Amidst the crowd, he spotted two familiar faces from the night before. Ron and Derek, who had mocked and disrespected him, now stood frozen, their eyes widening as they realized he was the new police chief. Their expressions shifted from surprise to unease and worry as they grasped the situation. Anthony, unfazed, maintained a steady, commanding gaze as he approached them. Ron, who had been so confident and arrogant the previous night, now looked uncomfortable. He awkwardly stepped forward, stumbling over his words. "Chief Carter, I apologize if we did anything inappropriate last night. We didn't realize that you were—" Anthony interrupted him, his voice calm but firm. "Last night, I saw exactly how you conduct yourselves. I witnessed the abuse of power you both felt you could wield without consequence. You belittled, mocked, and attempted to undermine someone's dignity simply because you thought you could get away with it." Derek, standing beside Ron, looked visibly flustered, trying to speak up in a remorseful tone. "Chief, we truly didn't mean any disrespect. Last night was just a bit of fun, just a joke." Anthony's brow furrowed as he cut Derek off, his tone cold and clear. "A joke? If that's how you joke with a stranger, I wonder how many townspeople here have had to endure your jokes." The room seemed to compress under a tense silence. The other officers stopped what they were doing, quietly observing the situation. Some glanced disapprovingly at Ron and Derek, while others looked at Anthony, appearing to assess his decisiveness and strength of character as their new leader. Taking a deep breath, Anthony continued in a steady but commanding tone. "I want you to understand that from today on, there will be no tolerance for any abuse of power or unprofessional conduct in this station. What happened last night will be thoroughly investigated, and no leniency will be given." Ron and Derek exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that this wouldn't end smoothly, and their clumsy apologies had done nothing to help. We understand, Chief," Ron stammered, bowing his head, unable to meet Anthony's gaze. Anthony nodded, his eyes sweeping over the room, pausing on each face to drive home the message he intended for the entire station. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to ensure that we work with integrity, respect, and accountability. And to do that, there will be necessary changes." His voice echoed, cold and decisive. "I will be implementing a new code of conduct, and everyone in the department will be required to undergo training on professional culture and fair, respectful treatment of citizens." The atmosphere in the room wasn't just tense, it was almost oppressive, making everyone present feel uneasy. Glances avoided each other, and the silence was broken only by a few anxious sighs. Everyone understood that, at this moment, each word and action could lead to serious consequences. Anthony was the only one who remained steady in the heavy atmosphere, his eyes bright with determination. His stern words weren't merely about duty, they reflected a heart that had witnessed too much injustice to tolerate it any longer. Anthony wasn't just issuing orders. He was sending a message about integrity and the courage needed within a team. Deep inside, he felt a complex mix of emotions, resolve mixed with a hint of sadness, knowing that confronting former colleagues was never easy. He looked over at Ron and Derek. Ron's face showed resentment, a stubbornness evident, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Ron realized that all his past actions were being exposed under the light of truth. Inside, he felt conflicted, a mix of remorse and irritation at being publicly reprimanded. He had always thought he could hide his actions, but Anthony's resolve shattered his confidence. His smugness had become a thin veil, barely hiding his weakness when faced with the truth. Conversely, Derek, typically more reserved, bore an expression of deep anxiety. His face had gone pale, speechless. Guilt weighed heavily on him, pressing down like a stone. He understood that the days of recklessness were over, and the leniency he'd relied on was now bringing consequences. Occasionally, he glanced at Anthony, and in his eyes, he saw not hatred, but deep disappointment. This realization made Derek, aware that he had betrayed the trust of his team, a feeling he had never experienced before. Others in the room, though not directly involved, felt the oppressive atmosphere. Some officers exchanged anxious glances, aware and cautious. Some felt a creeping fear, knowing they had also engaged in behavior similar to Ron and Derek's, even if to a lesser extent. They began to wonder if their actions would also be brought to light, and a sense of unease filled their hearts. Meanwhile, a few quietly admired Anthony. Standing among his colleagues, he remained steadfast, unafraid of losing favor or compromising with anyone. The honest officers sensed his seriousness, feeling as though a new force was empowering them in their work. One of them whispered to a colleague beside him, "This is what we've needed for a long time. We've all gotten too comfortable, but sometimes it takes someone like Anthony to set things right." As Anthony walked toward his office, his shoulders slumped slightly. Although he had shown strength before everyone, he still carried a sadness at facing this harsh reality. He knew that this would bring about significant change, but they were necessary steps to cleanse the department. His footsteps echoed through the silent room, a reminder that his duty wasn't only to protect the department, but also to uphold values and integrity. The officers in the room gradually returned to their tasks, yet it was clear to everyone that things had changed. Some couldn't help but sigh, while others remained quietly discussing, their expressions serious and contemplative. One officer put a hand on a colleague's shoulder and murmured, "We have to be more careful now. This isn't just a job, it's about the honor of each of us." No one knew exactly what would happen next, but they all understood that from now on, things wouldn't be as easy as they once were. As he entered his office, Anthony sat down in his chair, feeling the weight of the confrontation he had just experienced. He looked out at the clear blue sky through a small window. The warm sunlight seemed to remind him of why he had chosen this path. He was not someone who gave up easily, and certainly not the type to shy away from challenges. The recent confrontation was just one of many battles he knew he would face on his journey to bring real change to the police department. Anthony had witnessed too much injustice and too many instances where principles were discarded for personal gain. He had often felt powerless against a system so deeply rooted that it had grown indifferent to the cries of the people. But instead of stepping back, Anthony found himself more determined than ever. He knew that only persistence, seriousness, and integrity could bring about any real change. Justice wasn't just words on paper or slogans on walls. It had to be shown in every action and decision he and his colleagues made each day. His mind drifted to the faces of his colleagues. Among them, some shared his values, but many had lost faith in the system. These individuals now worked like machines, following orders without question. Anthony understood that he couldn't change everyone immediately, but he could start with those who shared his vision. He would seek out people with the same determination, build a team he could trust, and gradually spread this change throughout the organization. Anthony also understood that this was a long fight. He would face resistance, even misunderstanding, but that would not discourage him. With each step, he wanted to show that justice and responsibility were not distant ideals. They were the mission and the values he had chosen, and no matter the obstacles, Anthony would keep moving forward. If he didn't do this, no one would. After taking a deep breath, Anthony began planning an internal investigation into Ron and Derek's behavior. The investigation was launched soon after, and the response from the officers was just as Anthony had expected. Some of the senior officers showed displeasure, with a few openly expressing their frustration, claiming Anthony was too rigid and was disrupting the traditions of the department. A few senior officers, close to Ron and Derek, even began to band together, having private conversations and gradually forming an alliance in hopes of pressuring Anthony to back down. Ron and Derek, knowing they were in a difficult position, didn't stop trying to rally their colleagues to their side. "He's new, doesn't understand this place at all," Ron would say at gatherings, hoping to create a divide within the department. "We've been working here for years. No one ever complained. Why should we change just because of a new chief?" Some officers listened and seemed to agree, feeling that Anthony was complicating things. But not everyone felt that way. The younger officers, especially those like Tessa, who had a sense of purpose, began to notice Anthony's vision. Tessa, a smart and principled officer, saw Anthony's dedication to creating a fair and accountable workplace. Quietly, she supported him, feeling that this was a chance for the department to become better. Meanwhile, Anthony didn't limit himself to just investigating Ron and Derek. As he began thoroughly reviewing the department's records, he discovered many cases that had been ignored or swept aside, cases where officers had engaged in misconduct without serious consequences. Reports were left gathering dust and evidence was ignored. There seemed to be an invisible veil concealing all these wrongdoings, allowing unprofessional behavior to become part of the culture there. One by one, he went through the files, examining each detail carefully. Anthony felt that to bring real change to this department, he would need to make everything transparent. He began to reform the management system, requiring officers to record and report every case they handled accurately. At the same time, he implemented measures to ensure that all reports of misconduct would be handled openly and fairly. This made quite a few people uncomfortable. Ron and Derek, along with other older officers, began to voice stronger objections, saying that Anthony was making their everyday work difficult. "He's tearing this department apart," Derek complained bitterly to some other officers. "We've been doing things our way for years without any issues. Now he wants to change everything." Anthony knew that it would take time and that he would face significant resistance to implement these changes. But he also realized that not everyone was on Ron and Derek's side. Tessa and some younger officers began to show support for Anthony through small actions, such as more careful record-keeping, adhering to the new code of conduct, and displaying respect for colleagues and citizens in each task. One day, Tessa knocked on Anthony's office door and entered, carrying a thick folder. "Chief Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I found these reports. Several cases from the past were overlooked, but I think you should review them. There are many irregularities." Anthony took the file from Tessa's hands, flipping through the pages, seeing clear details of misconduct that officers had tried to cover up. He looked at Tessa, gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you, Tessa. This is very important information." Tessa's support was a huge motivation for Anthony, further strengthening his determination to face the challenges ahead. He knew that, in a long fight like this, having even a few people who understood and supported him could make all the difference. Anthony didn't stop at internal reform, but also began organizing training sessions on workplace culture and fair treatment of citizens. He required every officer to attend, accepting no excuses. In these sessions, Anthony spoke clearly about each person's responsibility, not just to their job, but to the community they served. Gradually, the attitude of the other officers started to shift. At first, there was reluctance, but over time, they began to see the value of these reforms. Investigations into misconduct were conducted openly, no longer hidden or ignored. Slowly, the work culture at the police station began to change, starting with the smallest actions of each officer. These changes, though small, were positive. Some officers even began to feel prouder of their work, knowing they were now part of a fair and responsible environment. Tessa and a few younger officers like her became role models, quietly creating a wave of change within the department. Anthony knew that the fight was far from over and that there was still much to change. But as he saw signs of hope in the support from Tessa and other conscientious officers, he understood that he was on the right path. This police department would no longer be a place of power abuse and irresponsibility, but one where people could take pride in their work and serve the community with respect and fairness. With determination and perseverance, Anthony continued his work, knowing that each step was creating significant change, a change that would leave a lasting impact on the town and everyone working within the police department. But there were still those who couldn't accept the changes easily. As soon as Anthony initiated the investigation and began altering work practices, Ron and Derek immediately reacted, seeking to protect their positions. The two quickly leveraged their close relationships in the department, contacting a few senior officials they knew to pressure Anthony. News of their actions soon reached Anthony. Within the first week of the investigation, he received a call from a senior official in the department. The man's tone was polite yet unmistakably clear. "Anthony, investigating and disciplining long-standing officers like Ron and Derek should be approached carefully. They've worked here for many years and have the respect of their colleagues. You understand that sometimes we need to maintain harmony, don't you?" Anthony listened to each word, remaining calm, fully aware that this was an attempt to persuade him to back down. "I understand what you're saying," Anthony replied, his voice steady and unwavering. "But I believe we can't maintain harmony by ignoring wrongdoing, especially when it impacts the community's trust. If we allow things to continue as they are, respect will gradually be replaced by doubt." The official sighed, clearly dissatisfied. "I just hope you'll think more carefully about your decision, Anthony." After the call, Anthony knew he needed to act even more decisively. The following morning, he decided to convene an internal meeting, inviting senior officials and representatives from the inspector's board. This meeting was not only to discuss the investigation, but also to provide him an opportunity to present his position and irrefutable evidence of Ron and Derek's misconduct. Anthony prepared thoroughly for the meeting, bringing along a recording of their late-night confrontation, along with documents and reports he and his colleagues had compiled. When the meeting began, he wasted no time. He played the recording, and everyone in the room sat in silence, listening to the mocking and insulting words Ron and Derek had directed at him that night. The contemptuous laughter, blatant ridicule, and abuse of power were clear in every word. A heavy silence filled the room when the recording ended, and for a moment, no one dared to speak. Some senior representatives could not hide their discomfort and embarrassment, while others looked at Anthony with piercing eyes but refrained from objecting. Anthony stood, his gaze resolute and voice firm. "This is how some of our officers are treating people. If they can do this to me, a fellow officer, I can't imagine how they treat ordinary citizens. I cannot and will not tolerate any abuse of power under my leadership." A prolonged silence hung in the room as Anthony's words settled. Finally, one of the inspector board representatives spoke. "Anthony, you've made your point very clear, and with this evidence, we cannot ignore the issue. You have full authority to proceed with the investigation." A few other senior officials, though hesitant, couldn't deny the gravity of the matter. Another representative looked at Anthony, giving a slight nod. "You have our support, Anthony. If this is what's needed to restore respect and trust in the community, we will stand with you." After the meeting ended, Anthony felt a sense of relief. He knew that the members of the inspector board had recognized the necessity of this investigation. The leaders in the department, though reluctant, had to accept the truth and couldn't stop him from moving forward. The feedback he received from the members during the meeting not only showed their understanding, but also signaled that he would receive the necessary support for the upcoming investigation. Anthony understood clearly that things would not be easy from this point on. Even though he had gained their consensus, he knew there were hidden forces within the department that did not fully agree with him. Some people seemed displeased that he was delving into issues they would rather keep concealed. This only strengthened his resolve and vigilance, as hidden opposition often brought with it many potential risks. He prepared himself to face obstacles and was determined not to let anyone or anything stand in the way of his investigation. On the way back to his office, Anthony thought about the next steps. He needed to gather strong evidence and prepare a detailed and thorough investigation plan. His suspicions grew with each step, but he also felt confident that he was on the right path. He began listing the suspects, organizing the documents he had gathered, and planned to start interviewing those involved in the case. Step by step, he would need to persuade witnesses to reveal what they knew, even if doing so made them uncomfortable or fearful. Anthony knew that, to succeed in this investigation, he would need not only the support of the inspector board, but also confidence in himself. Challenges would continue to arise, but his passion for justice and truth would drive him forward. He reminded himself that, no matter how difficult or dangerous the journey ahead, he would not give up. But not everything was easy. Ron and Derek, realizing that their plan to leverage relationships had failed, resorted to other tactics. They began spreading rumors within the department, claiming that Anthony was only trying to make a name for himself. They told colleagues that he was making a big deal out of things to fast-track his career, attempting to stir up doubt and resentment among other officers. Despite this, Anthony remained undeterred. He continued his work, steadily implementing the changes he had proposed. He began organizing mandatory workplace culture training sessions for the entire team. In these sessions, he explained the importance of respecting citizens and building a professional work environment. Younger officers like Tessa gradually became important allies. Tessa not only participated, but also enthusiastically helped in conveying the new code of conduct, becoming a proactive force for change within the department. Gradually, small but significant changes began to appear. A few officers, initially resistant, slowly came to understand the value of these reforms. Younger officers saw in Anthony a steadfast, fair leader, unafraid to stand up to power. They began to feel prouder to work in an environment with clear principles, knowing they wouldn't have to endure unfair treatment from those abusing authority. Ron and Derek, feeling the growing isolation within the department, couldn't ignore that their opposition was failing. They realized they had no other choice but to comply with the new rules if they wanted to keep their positions. Ultimately, both began attending the training sessions reluctantly, remaining silent and avoiding any confrontation with Anthony. For some in the department, these changes brought renewed hope for a better work environment. Tessa, in a conversation with Anthony, said, "Chief Carter, maybe it's tough at first, but I believe what you're doing will help us become a team the town can truly trust." Anthony smiled, grateful for Tessa's support and that of other officers. This was proof that his efforts were not in vain. He knew that changing an entrenched culture was no easy feat, but with people like Tessa and other passionate young officers by his side, he could go even further. This small victory, compelling Ron and Derek to follow the rules and begin to adjust their attitudes, was the first step in the journey of reform. Anthony held no illusions that everything would instantly become smooth. He understood that the battle to build a fair and transparent police department was still a long one. But seeing the shift in his colleagues' attitudes, he believed he was on the right path. Before wrapping up work one weekend evening, Anthony sat in his office looking out the window as the sky began to change colors with the setting sun. He knew that challenges and conflicts still lay ahead, but the support of loyal and principled colleagues was the motivation he needed to continue this arduous journey. Meanwhile, the internal investigation within the police department continued under Anthony's strict oversight. As old cases were reviewed, numerous complaints of abuse of power by certain officers began to surface. Victims of these abuses, those who had endured injustice, disrespect, and sometimes unnecessary violence from the police, were now finding the courage to speak up. Anthony and his investigation team took each complaint seriously, carefully gathering evidence and testimonies to ensure that every allegation was objectively reviewed. The investigation went beyond simply examining complaints. It also involved cross-checking specific actions in each report. Anthony's team thoroughly inspected work records, from detention logs to the procedures officers followed at crime scenes. In cases suspected of power abuse or ethical violations, Anthony called for in-depth investigations, which included direct interviews with the officers involved. All processes were conducted with the presence of independent overseers to ensure there was no bias. Anthony understood that this wasn't just a matter of administrative procedure, but a question of justice and the community's trust in the police department. To clarify each case, he and his colleagues, those who shared his commitment to reform, worked tirelessly day and night, searching for critical evidence such as recordings, security camera footage, and witness testimonies. Interviews were conducted meticulously, with independent observers present to guarantee transparency and honesty. Additionally, Anthony regularly organized progress meetings to review and consolidate the investigation results, making adjustments as necessary to ensure timely completion. He consistently emphasized to his team the importance of exposing these wrongdoings to rebuild trust, and to demonstrate that justice would be upheld fairly, regardless of who the violator was. After weeks of investigation, the case was brought to court with the full attendance of jury members, lawyers, and representatives from the media. The trial attracted public attention due to serious allegations of abuse of power by certain officers. The evidence presented included recordings, surveillance camera footage, and witness testimonies, all of which demonstrated Ron and Derek's abuse of power, procedural mishandlings, indifference, and even disdain toward the public. As the evidence was displayed, each word from the prosecution resonated heavily, exposing the misconduct they had committed. The recordings captured coarse language, discriminatory remarks, and a lack of compassion in their actions, causing a moment of silence to fall over the courtroom. Ron and Derek, seated quietly at the defendant's table, could not deny what they were hearing. Each piece of evidence felt like a blow, reminding them of actions they might once have thought would never come to light. Both felt the weight of their past mistakes and seemed to gain a deep awareness of the responsibility for their actions. The trial lasted several hours, at times seeming endless as each witness recounted their painful experiences. But when it came time for a verdict, the jury deliberated thoroughly, considering all factors. While the charges could lead to severe penalties, possibly even prison time, the jury took note of the change in Ron and Derek's attitudes since the reform process began. Their genuine remorse and cooperative participation in Anthony's new workplace culture programs left a strong impression. No longer arrogant, they displayed respect and a clear awareness of their responsibilities, demonstrating a readiness to change and make amends. At the end of the trial, the jury rendered a more compassionate decision. Instead of prison, Ron and Derek would face an educational and constructive penalty. Both were suspended for a period and required to participate fully in the police department's reform program, including courses on professional ethics, community communication skills, and humane handling of situations. Additionally, they were ordered to provide financial compensation to their victims, emphasizing that rectifying wrongs goes beyond mere apologies and must involve concrete accountability. This decision held profound significance, serving both as a discipline and as an opportunity for Ron and Derek to redeem themselves and contribute positively to the community. It was also a reminder to the entire police department that abuse of power would never be tolerated and that all actions are accountable to the law and the public. Anthony observed this decision with a sense of relief. He believed that justice had been served, not only through punishment, but also through the opportunity to make amends. Ron and Derek had acknowledged their mistakes and now faced the consequences, while also being given the chance to contribute positively to the police department. In the weeks following the trial, both, under close supervision, began working more diligently, participating in reform activities, supporting colleagues, and even meeting and apologizing to their victims. Their involvement in the reform process became a testament to the transformation and rebirth of the police department. No longer abusers of power, Ron and Derek had become contributors to justice, helping create a fairer working environment. Anthony observed this development with confidence that, despite the challenges, the reforms he had initiated were now truly sustainable. After intense confrontations and strong reform measures, a wave of change began to spread throughout the police department. Officers gradually recognized Anthony's determination and understood that the changes he proposed were not just empty words. People started to feel that the work environment under his leadership was not only about discipline, but also about fairness, responsibility, and pride in their work. To further drive the reform process, Anthony organized open discussions each week where every officer could express their thoughts. These discussions were not only about introducing new regulations, but also provided officers the opportunity to share their personal views on their profession and their responsibilities to the community. Anthony encouraged everyone to speak, even those who had previously opposed him, aiming to make all officers feel like they were part of the change. In one discussion, Anthony stood before the team, his voice steady and resonant. "I know change is difficult, and not everyone adapts immediately. But if we work together, if we truly prioritize the community's interests, I believe we can build a police department that everyone can be proud of." His words were not just theoretical, they were filled with sincerity, causing many to rethink their jobs and their roles. Tessa, an enthusiastic young officer, had begun to trust and admire Anthony from the beginning. She not only participated actively in the discussions, but also volunteered to help Anthony implement new regulations and investigate unresolved cases. She saw this as an opportunity to contribute to a fairer and more transparent workplace. Tessa became one of Anthony's most trusted allies, willing to stand by him in every task. Additionally, Chris, a veteran officer who had worked at the department since its early days, also began to recognize Anthony's vision. Initially, Chris was somewhat skeptical, assuming these reforms would be temporary. But as he observed Anthony, tirelessly working, determined to address each issue, Chris realized that Anthony's efforts were not just for show, but genuinely aimed to transform the department from the inside out. Chris decided to side with Anthony, offering his support in every matter. Anthony and his team quickly set to work investigating complaints from residents. They discovered numerous cases that had previously been ignored or handled superficially. Complaints of abuse of power, disrespectful behavior by certain officers, and even investigative misconduct. These documents revealed serious issues within the police department that had been left unaddressed. Tessa and Chris, along with other young officers, worked tirelessly to review each case and complaint, ensuring that everything would be investigated and handled openly and transparently. They were determined to clarify each issue, not allowing any incident to be covered up or overlooked. Their efforts earned the trust of the community, helping citizens feel reassured, knowing that the police department genuinely cared about their rights. One day, while reviewing complaint files, Anthony realized that his reforms had begun to yield tangible results. Some residents had sent letters of thanks for the changes and the transparency in investigating complaints. Young officers in the department also started to shift their perspectives on their work. They no longer viewed it as merely a job, but as a profound responsibility toward the community. Anthony decided to expand the workplace culture training sessions, not just focusing on rules, but also on ethical values and respect for the public. He encouraged officers to see their role not only as enforcers of the law, but also as protectors of every citizen's rights. In one session, he shared, "We're not just working as police officers, we're members of this community. What we do doesn't just affect us, but everyone around us." Anthony's words, along with his steadfast actions, had truly transformed the mindset of the officers. The journey of change for Ron and Derek was long and challenging, requiring them to confront and overcome the mistakes of their past, mistakes they had once tried to ignore. Initially, after returning to work following the trial, both had to face the scrutinizing eyes of their colleagues and the doubt of those affected by their actions. Feelings of embarrassment and shame weighed on them, making every step in the department feel heavy. Yet these emotions motivated Ron and Derek to look inward and recognize that, to truly change, they had to confront the wounds they had inflicted. Under Anthony's guidance and encouragement, Ron and Derek gradually rebuilt their images. Anthony was not just their supervisor, he became a teacher and a friend, helping them understand that justice is not only about punishment, but also about making amends and restoring trust. Ron began participating in professional ethics training, where he learned to think more deeply about his role within the community. Previously, his work had been merely a duty to complete, but now Ron understood that his responsibility was to protect and serve, not to wield power. Step by step, he practiced putting himself in the citizens' shoes, listening to their stories and genuine needs, and realizing that a police officer's role is not only to uphold the law, but also to build trust. For Derek, who had been influenced by outdated and authoritarian attitudes, change came from a meeting with his past victims. He once believed that apologizing was a sign of weakness, but facing the genuine reproach and heartfelt words of the people, he realized that only by apologizing could he truly free himself from the past. Derek not only offered sincere apologies, but also took the time to listen to the stories of those who had been harmed by his actions. These encounters became a catalyst for empathy and a complete shift in his approach to his work and the community. Both men worked tirelessly to demonstrate their change through action. They actively participated in departmental reform activities, such as organizing workshops on building trust and professional ethics and creating a space for colleagues to exchange and share experiences. Ron and Derek became pioneers in building a new culture where justice and compassion were paramount. They, along with their teammates, engaged with the community, listening to and understanding the real needs of the citizens, working to connect the police department with the community through empathy and understanding. Over time, Ron and Derek's transformation became more than a personal effort. It grew into a powerful force driving the department's reform journey forward. Those who had once doubted began to change their perspectives as they witnessed the sincerity and determination of Ron and Derek. From officers who had once caused pain, they had transformed into sources of inspiration, becoming models of redemption and learning how to rebuild after past mistakes. Anthony, who had placed his faith in the reform, saw in Ron and Derek's change a glimmer of hope for a better future for the police department. Now, those who had once abused power had become true defenders of justice, helping to build a fairer, more compassionate work environment. Their transformation was clear evidence that reform is not only about changing the system, but also about changing from within, opening a new chapter where redemption and empathy are the sustainable foundations for rebuilding trust within the community. Meanwhile, Chris and Tessa continued supporting Anthony, not only in implementing the reforms, but also in building trust among the younger officers. Tessa had become one of the most active in creating a new work environment. She organized small discussions, encouraging colleagues to share their thoughts and concerns. We may not agree on everything, but the important thing is that we're building a police department that everyone can be proud of, Tessa told her colleagues, fostering an atmosphere of unity. At the same time, Anthony and his associates continued reviewing outstanding cases, making transparent and open decisions. As these cases were addressed, the town's residents grew increasingly confident in the police department's transformation. They began to see that their complaints were no longer ignored, but instead were handled seriously and fairly. With each passing day, the police department became a place of order and respect. The officers worked with a heightened sense of responsibility, realizing that every action they took directly impacted the department's image. Anthony's discussions and training sessions helped officers not only understand the value of their work, but also feel like they were truly part of a positive change. One morning, as Anthony entered the department, he felt a distinctly different atmosphere. The officers were working diligently, conversing with one another in a friendly manner. Anthony stood quietly, observing the scene, feeling a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. He knew that this reform was not solely his accomplishment, but the result of everyone's efforts within the department. This was the beginning of a new work culture, where each officer felt pride in their role and a responsibility to the community they served. Before heading to his office, Anthony saw Tessa and Chris hard at work. He smiled at them gratefully, understanding that without the support and dedication of teammates like them, things might have been different. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice warm. "But there's still much to be done. And I believe that with everyone's unity, this police department will become the pride of the town." Tessa smiled, her eyes filled with determination and trust. "We'll always stand by you, Chief. That's why we're here, to make a difference together." Anthony nodded, feeling the growing bond within his team. He knew that with each passing day, this police department was becoming not just a place for enforcing justice, but a symbol of trust, fairness, and responsibility in the community. After months of tireless effort, the police department under Anthony's leadership had undergone a profound and lasting change. The tension and caution among officers had given way to an open, fair, and proud work environment. Anthony felt a quiet satisfaction each time he witnessed his colleagues cooperating sincerely, respecting, and supporting each other in their daily work. One sunny day, as Anthony was reviewing the weekly reports, a letter arrived from the mayor's office. In it, the mayor wrote, "Anthony, I want to express my deepest gratitude for what you've done for the police department and the entire town. Thanks to your determination and perseverance, the work environment at the station has not only become more professional, but the community's trust in the police has also been restored and strengthened. Our team is proud to have a leader like you." Anthony folded the letter with a gentle smile. The mayor's praise was an important acknowledgement, but what pleased him most were the concrete results he witnessed each day. It wasn't only the new policies and procedures, it was the shift in the mindset and actions of each officer. Respect and trust had started to take root in the department's culture, becoming a natural part of their work ethic. Later that day, another letter arrived from a family in town, the family of Mrs. Eleanor, who had once been a victim of discrimination. Mrs. Eleanor wrote, "Our family once thought that justice didn't exist for ordinary people like us. But through your efforts, we now feel that there are still people who truly care and fight for fairness. You haven't only changed the police department, you've brought hope to people like us." Reading Mrs. Eleanor's heartfelt words, Anthony felt his emotions surge. For him, this was the very reason he had started this journey, to ensure that everyone in town could be treated fairly, without discrimination and fear. The changes he had implemented weren't confined to the police department. They had spread throughout the community, fostering a renewed trust among the people. Since taking his position, Anthony's reforms have brought about many positive, tangible changes. Officers like Tessa and Chris, who had supported him from the beginning, had become pillars of the new work culture. They continuously encouraged their colleagues to join in initiatives to improve the department. Tessa organized small workshops to share experiences and instill pride in each officer, while Chris took on the role of mentoring new officers, passing down the values he and Anthony had built together. The open discussions Anthony organized also became an essential part of the police department's work culture. Conversations were no longer tense or hesitant. Instead, people felt comfortable sharing ideas, asking questions, and even proposing new ways to strengthen relations between the police and the community. Anthony listened to every opinion, whether from a veteran officer or a recruit. He wanted everyone to feel they had a voice and were part of the change. Under Anthony's leadership, the police department gradually rebuilt its trust in the community. Long-standing cases were resolved quickly and transparently, and residents' complaints were no longer ignored. Step by step, people began to feel more at ease interacting with the police. Those who had once doubted now saw that they were respected and heard, that the department truly cared about protecting everyone's rights and upholding justice. One evening, as Anthony prepared to leave, Tessa walked into his office carrying a folder. "Chief, I want to thank you for believing in us," she said with a sincere smile. "What you've done hasn't only changed this place, it's changed us, every one of us." Anthony looked at Tessa and nodded gently. "Tessa, it wasn't only me who brought about these changes. It was all of you. I was just the spark. The success of this department is due to the efforts of people like you, Chris, and the rest of the team. We've built something good here, and I believe it will last." That afternoon, a large meeting was held with the mayor's office in attendance. The mayor stood up to speak, his voice resonating throughout the room. "The change we see today is a testament to the unwavering determination and effort of Chief Anthony. Thanks to him, we have built a police department that this town can be proud of. On behalf of the community, I want to express our deepest gratitude." As everyone applauded, Anthony simply smiled. He didn't seek fame or recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing that justice was being served, and that the fair, respectful work environment he had envisioned had truly come to life. After the meeting concluded, Anthony quietly stepped out of the police station, gazing at the building that had witnessed so many ups and downs, challenges, and victories. He knew that this journey was not only about him, but about all his teammates who had changed alongside him. As he looked up at the night sky, with stars sparkling brightly, Anthony felt his heart fill with hope. Under his leadership and the unity of everyone involved, this police station had become a symbol of fairness, responsibility, and trust, not only for the town, but also for generations of officers to come. Standing there, he reflected on the challenges he and his colleagues had overcome. He recalled those early days when he first took his position, when every glance was filled with doubt, and his reforms faced strong opposition from some people. But it was in those tough moments that he found his true allies, those willing to support and fight with him for a higher purpose. People like Tessa, Chris, and even Ron and Derek, who had once been on opposing sides but had now transformed, becoming steadfast pillars of the department. Anthony sensed a transformation, not only in the work environment, but in the individuals within it. Step by step, the reforms had shifted mindsets, helping everyone understand that the responsibility of a police officer was not only to enforce the law, but also to protect justice and serve the community wholeheartedly. His efforts had sown a new belief in each officer, a belief that every small action, every decision they made daily, could make a difference not only in the police station, but also within the community. Looking out at the twinkling lights of the distant town, Anthony reminded himself that his work was not about leaving a personal mark, but about building a legacy. He hoped that this police station, with the values he and his team had worked so hard to establish, would become a model for other departments in the region. A place where justice was enforced fairly and compassionately, where citizens could always come with trust and peace of mind. With steady steps and unchanging resolve, Anthony walked forward, believing that a brighter future awaited. The changes he had created would not just endure for one generation, but would last forever, becoming the foundation for the very best within the community he served, a reminder of courage, determination, and the value of justice. In the end, the arrogant officers learned that pride and prejudice come with a price. If you were the new chief in this story, how would you have handled them? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow more inspiring stories. See you next time.
Picture this, a courtroom in downtown Atlanta where the morning sunlight streams through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. It's just another Tuesday morning in 2019, and Judge Marcus Thompson is adjusting his robes before heading to his chambers. After 15 years on the bench, he's earned a reputation as one of the most respected judicial figures in Georgia. But today isn't going to be like any other day. The security checkpoint at the courthouse entrance is usually a brief formality for Judge Thompson. He's walked through these halls thousands of times, greeting the same familiar faces, exchanging warm smiles with the staff who've known him for years. But today, there's a new officer on duty, Officer James Barrett, recently transferred from a smaller county. As Judge Thompson approaches the security line, briefcase in hand, something feels different. The usual morning chatter dies down, and the air grows thick with tension. What happens next would not only test the limits of human dignity, but also challenge our deepest assumptions about power, respect, and the ability to rise above prejudice. "Sir, I need you to step aside." Officer Barrett's voice cuts through the quiet lobby. His tone carries an edge that makes several heads turn. Judge Thompson, dressed in a crisp suit beneath his judicial robes, pauses. For a moment, he's not a judge with decades of experience. He's just another black man being singled out by a white officer. "I'm Judge Thompson," he says calmly, reaching for his courthouse ID. But Officer Barrett is already motioning him toward a separate area, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Sure you are. And I'm the President of the United States." The officer's sarcasm draws uncomfortable glances from the growing crowd of courthouse employees and morning visitors. What follows is a scene that would later be described by witnesses as both heartbreaking and transformative. Officer Barrett, seemingly unmoved by the protests of nearby court staff who know the judge well, proceeds to subject Judge Thompson to a humiliating public search. Arms out, legs spread, he commands, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that makes several onlookers wince. Throughout the ordeal, Judge Thompson remains surprisingly composed. His eyes, meeting those of familiar faces in the crowd, hold something unexpected, not anger, not hatred, but something else entirely. It's an expression that would later become the talk of the courthouse and eventually the entire city. The morning's events could have easily exploded into headlines about racism in the justice system, about abuse of power, about everything wrong with our society. Instead, what happened next would challenge everyone's expectations and offer a masterclass in human dignity and wisdom. As Officer Barrett finally finishes his unnecessarily thorough search, clearly finding nothing suspicious, Judge Thompson does something that leaves everyone speechless. But before we reveal his response, a reaction that would change not only Officer Barrett's life, but influence an entire community, let's understand what was really at stake that morning. This wasn't just about a white officer and a black judge. It was about a moment that would test the very principles that Judge Thompson had spent his career upholding: justice, fairness, and the belief that every person, regardless of their actions, deserves the chance to learn and grow. The courthouse lobby had fallen completely silent. Court clerks, attorneys, and citizens waiting for their morning hearings all stood frozen, watching this scene unfold. Some had their phones out, expecting the situation to escalate into yet another viral video of racial injustice. But Judge Thompson had different plans. In his 15 years on the bench, he had seen humanity at its worst and its best. He had handed down sentences that changed lives, presided over cases that tested his faith in justice, and witnessed countless moments of both cruelty and redemption. But perhaps nothing had prepared him for this moment, quite like his grandfather's words, spoken to him decades ago on their front porch in rural Georgia. "Son, the true measure of a man isn't how he treats those who respect him, but how he responds to those who don't." As Officer Barrett finally steps back, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, Judge Thompson straightens his robes. The next few words he speaks would not only shock everyone present but would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge our understanding of forgiveness, dignity, and the power of human connection. What Judge Thompson does next defies every expectation, breaks every stereotype, and offers a lesson that extends far beyond the walls of that courthouse. His response, unexpected, powerful, and deeply human, reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes begin in the most difficult moments. But before we reveal Judge Thompson's remarkable reaction, it's important to understand that what happens next isn't just about proving Officer Barrett wrong. It's about something much bigger. A moment that would spark conversations across the city, inspire a movement within the justice system, and demonstrate that even in our most humiliating moments, we have the power to choose how our story unfolds. As Judge Thompson opens his mouth to speak, the entire courthouse holds its breath, waiting to see how this story will unfold. The weight of silence in that courthouse lobby feels almost physical as Judge Thompson takes a deep breath. His mind drifts briefly to that morning's breakfast with his teenage son, who had been asking about dealing with prejudice at his new high school. "Sometimes, son," he had said, "the hardest battles aren't fought with fists, but with wisdom." Now, standing here, those words echo in his thoughts. As Judge Thompson begins to speak, his voice carries the same measured tone he's known for in his courtroom, neither angry nor defeated, but filled with an authority that comes from somewhere deeper than his judicial position. "Officer Barrett," he says, causing the smirk to freeze on the officer's face, "would you join me in my chambers for a moment?" The request catches everyone off guard. The courthouse regulars exchange glances, while a few whisper among themselves. They've seen Judge Thompson handle difficult situations before, but this feels different. Officer Barrett's confidence wavers for the first time that morning, his hand unconsciously adjusting his badge. What few people in that lobby knew was that exactly 30 years ago, a young Marcus Thompson had stood in a similar situation, except he wasn't wearing judge's robes then, just a college sweatshirt and jeans. That experience had shaped his path toward law school, toward becoming the kind of judge who could make a difference. But he'd never imagined he'd be testing those principles quite like this. The walk to the judge's chambers feels like an eternity. The click of shoes against marble floors echoes through the corridors, each step building tension. Officer Barrett follows behind, his earlier bravado diminishing with each stride. The same man who minutes ago had publicly humiliated a judge now looks increasingly uncertain about what awaits him behind those heavy wooden doors. As they approach the chamber entrance, Ms. Eleanor, Judge Thompson's clerk of 12 years, steps forward with concern etched on her face. She's seen the judge handle countless difficult situations with grace, but the look she gives him now carries decades of shared understanding about what it means to be black in a position of authority. The judge gives her a subtle nod, one that says both "I'm okay" and "trust me on this." Inside the chambers, morning sunlight filters through Venetian blinds, creating strips of light across the judge's desk. Photos line the walls, images of Judge Thompson with his family, with community leaders, at graduation ceremonies where he's spoken. One particular photo, slightly faded but prominently displayed, shows a young Thompson standing with his grandfather outside their first family home in Atlanta. Officer Barrett's eyes scan the room, taking in the law degrees from Emory University, the various awards for judicial excellence, and the community service plaques that cover nearly an entire wall. The realization of his mistake begins to dawn on his face, but Judge Thompson isn't interested in mere embarrassment or a quick apology. Instead, the judge walks to his desk and pulls out an old, worn leather folder. "Before we discuss what happened out there," he begins, "I'd like to share something with you." His hands rest on the folder, and for a moment, he pauses, as if weighing the significance of what he's about to reveal. What that folder contains, and why Judge Thompson chooses this moment to share it, speaks to a deeper story that goes beyond this morning's confrontation. It connects to a pattern of similar incidents across the country, the conversations happening in homes and workplaces, to the very heart of how we handle prejudice and power in America. But there's something else at play here, too. As Judge Thompson begins to open the folder, Officer Barrett notices the judge's hands. They're steady, calm, showing no sign of the anger or frustration that anyone else might feel in this situation. It's this detail that starts to crack something in Barrett's defensive armor. The story contained in that folder would challenge everything Officer Barrett thought he knew about authority, about justice, and about the man standing before him. But before Judge Thompson can begin to explain, there's a knock at the chamber door. Ms. Eleanor enters with an urgent message that adds yet another layer to this already complex morning. The message she carries isn't just about courthouse business. It's about something that happened earlier that week, something that connects directly to why Officer Barrett was transferred to this courthouse in the first place. As she hands the note to Judge Thompson, her eyes move between the two men, understanding that she's witnessing something far more significant than a simple confrontation between a judge and an officer. Judge Thompson reads the note, and for the first time that morning, his composed expression shifts slightly. He looks at Officer Barrett with new understanding, as if seeing him through a different lens. The judge places the note on his desk, next to the still unopened folder, and leans back in his chair. The tension in the room shifts, becoming something more complex than simple antagonism or authority. There's a story emerging here that's bigger than either man expected when they woke up this morning. It's a story about assumptions and appearances, about the weight of past experiences, and about the unexpected connections that can emerge in the midst of conflict. As Judge Thompson prepares to speak again, the morning sunlight catches the edge of that mysterious folder, highlighting its worn edges and the weight of whatever history it contains. The next few minutes in this chamber wouldn't just address what happened in the lobby. They would uncover something far more profound about both men's journeys to this moment. The note on Judge Thompson's desk seems to carry the weight of untold stories. As he looks up at Officer Barrett, his expression shifts from stern authority to something more complex, understanding mixed with concern. "Tell me, Officer Barrett," he begins, his voice gentle but firm, "what brought you to our courthouse from Clayton County?" Barrett shifts uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by an uncertainty he clearly isn't used to showing. Outside the chamber windows, the morning bustle of the courthouse continues, but in here, time seems to stand still. The question hangs in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. "It wasn't my choice," Barrett finally admits, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seem to cost him something to say, his hands, resting on his knees, clenched slightly. "There was an incident," he trails off, looking anywhere but at the judge. Judge Thompson nods slowly, tapping the note on his desk. "Yes, I'm reading about that incident right now. A confrontation with a black teenager outside a convenience store." He pauses, letting the words settle. "The report says you were convinced he was shoplifting. Turns out he was the owner's son, helping close up for the night." Barrett's face reddens, but there's something in his expression beyond simple embarrassment, a glimpse of pain, perhaps even shame. The judge notices this subtle shift, remembering something his grandmother used to say, "Hurt people hurt people." Meanwhile, in the lobby, word of what happened earlier has spread quickly. Ms. Eleanor fields questions from concerned colleagues while trying to maintain order in the judge's absence. She thinks back to similar incidents over the years, remembering how Judge Thompson handled each one with a wisdom that often surprised everyone involved. Inside the chambers, Judge Thompson finally opens the worn leather folder. Inside are newspaper clippings, some yellow with age. The top one, dated 1989, shows a younger version of himself in a college sweatshirt, standing outside a different courthouse. The headline reads, "Local student files complaint against police officer, sparks community dialogue." 30 years ago, Judge Thompson begins, his voice taking on the tone he often uses when mentoring young lawyers. "I was pre-law at Emory. One night, leaving the library, an officer stopped me. He was convinced I'd stolen the books in my backpack." He pauses, watching Barrett's reaction carefully. What happened next changed both our lives. As he speaks, another knock at the door interrupts them. This time, it's Officer Rodriguez, Barrett's supervisor. She enters with a concerned look, carrying a file of her own. "Judge Thompson, I apologize for the interruption. There's something you need to see regarding Officer Barrett's history." The tension in the room shifts again as Rodriguez places the file next to the judge's folder. Barrett's face drains of color. Clearly, whatever is in that file isn't something he wanted brought to light. But Judge Thompson's expression remains unchanged, his eyes still focused on the old newspaper clipping. "Before we open this," Judge Thompson says, gesturing to Rodriguez's file, "I want to share what happened after that night 30 years ago. The officer who stopped me, Officer Daniel Matthews, he's the reason I'm sitting in this chair today." Barrett looks up, confusion clear on his face. This isn't how he expected this conversation to go. Outside, the morning sun has fully risen, casting the chamber in warm light that seems at odds with the heavy atmosphere within. "You see," Judge Thompson continues, "Officer Matthews could have let his pride, his prejudice, or his power guide his actions that night. Instead, he chose to listen, to learn. What he did next." The judge pauses, looking between Barrett and Rodriguez. "Well, that's surprisingly similar to what's in this new file about you, Officer Barrett." Rodriguez steps forward, her hand resting on the file she brought. "Judge, there's something else you should know. The teenager from the convenience store incident, his father reached out to us this morning. He's asking to meet with Officer Barrett, but not for the reasons we might think." The judge nods slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He reaches for both files, the one containing his past and the one holding Barrett's present, and places them side by side. "Sometimes," he says, "the hardest moments in our lives have a way of connecting in ways we never expect." As he opens both files, the story they tell together begins to reveal something none of them saw coming. A pattern emerges, linking past and present, connecting lives in ways that challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, redemption, and the power of facing our own prejudices. The silence in Judge Thompson's chambers grows heavier as he begins reading from both files. Officer Barrett's leg bounces nervously, a gesture that seems out of place for someone who carried himself so confidently just an hour ago. Officer Rodriguez stands by the window, her shadow casting long lines across the carpet as the morning sun climbs higher. 6 months ago," Judge Thompson reads aloud, his voice steady and clear, "you responded to a call about a disturbance at Grove Park Community Center." He looks up at Barrett, whose face has gone completely still. "According to this report, you found a group of young black men playing basketball after hours. But instead of immediately confronting them," the judge pauses, studying Barrett's reaction. Barrett swallows hard, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I recognized one of them," he says quietly, "from another call, weeks before. He was—" Barrett's voice catches, and for the first time that morning, his tough exterior cracks completely. Officer Rodriguez steps forward. "That young man was Marcus Hayward," she adds, her voice gentle, the same teenager Barrett had wrongly accused at the convenience store. She looks at Judge Thompson meaningfully. What Officer Barrett did that night at the community center isn't in any official report, but Marcus's father made sure we knew about it. Meanwhile, outside in the courthouse lobby, whispers circulate about what's happening behind those chamber doors. Ms. Eleanor manages the growing crowd of curious onlookers, including several judges who have heard about the morning's incident. Among them stands an elderly man who arrived just moments ago, Officer Daniel Matthews, now retired, the very officer from Judge Thompson's past. Back in the chambers, Judge Thompson pulls out another document from his old leather folder. "Officer Barrett, before we continue, I want you to look at this." He slides a faded photograph across the desk. It shows a young black teenager in handcuffs, tears streaming down his face, standing outside a library. "That's me, 30 years ago, the night that changed everything." Barrett looks at the photo, then at the judge, his face a mix of emotions he can't quite hide. The connection between past and present hangs in the air like a physical thing, waiting to be acknowledged. "But here's what you don't know," Judge Thompson continues, pulling out another photo. This was taken 6 months later. The image shows the same young Thompson, now smiling, standing between Officer Matthews and a group of other police officers outside a community center. Before he can explain further, there's another knock at the door. Ms. Eleanor enters, her expression urgent. "Judge Thompson, sir. Officer Matthews is here." She pauses, glancing at Barrett. "And Marcus Hayward and his father just arrived too." The tension in the room reaches a breaking point. Barrett stands abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't." He begins, but Judge Thompson raises his hand. "Officer Barrett," the judge says, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "What happened at that community center 6 months ago? What did you do that Marcus's father wanted us to know about? Barrett's hands are trembling now, all pretense of authority stripped away. He looks between the judge and Rodriguez, then at the door where he knows Marcus Howard waits. The story he's about to tell, the real reason he was transferred to this courthouse, isn't what anyone expects. Judge Thompson leans forward, picking up both the old photo of himself and the new file about Barrett. Sometimes, he says softly, our biggest moments of shame can lead to our greatest opportunities for change. Just ask Officer Matthews. As if on cue, the door opens wider. Officer Matthews, now in his 70s but still standing tall, steps into the chamber. Behind him, Marcus Hayward and his father wait in the doorway. The moment feels charged with 3 decades of history, prejudice, redemption, and possibility. Barrett looks like he might bolt from the room, but something in Judge Thompson's expression holds him there. The judge stands, walking around his desk until he's face to face with the officer who had humiliated him just an hour before. Before anyone says another word, Judge Thompson announces, picking up the mysterious note that started this deeper conversation, there's something everyone in this room needs to know about what really happened that night at Grove Park Community Center. As they file out of the chambers, the morning's hostility transformed into something unexpectedly hopeful. Judge Thompson pauses. Oh, and Officer Barrett, next time you want to check my credentials. He smiles warmly. Just remember to look up at my portrait in the main hall. Right next to it, you'll find a smaller photo of a young man in handcuffs outside a library and the officer who changed his life. The tension in Judge Thompson's chambers crackles as he holds up the mysterious note, his eyes moving between Officer Barrett and Marcus Hayward. Before I read this, he says, his voice carrying quiet authority, I want everyone to understand something. What happened this morning at that security checkpoint wasn't just about power or prejudice. It was about fear. Officer Barrett shifts uncomfortably, but Judge Thompson continues. Fear is what made a young officer stop me outside that library 30 years ago. Fear is what made you confront Marcus at his father's store. And fear is what drove your actions this morning. He pauses, letting his words sink in. But it's what we do with that fear that defines us. Marcus steps forward, surprising everyone by speaking directly to Barrett. When you showed up at the community center that night, we were all ready for the worst. We'd seen the videos, heard the stories, but then you did something none of us expected. Barrett's face flushes red as Marcus continues. You sat down on those bleachers and talked to us, really talked, about growing up in a small town where you never knew any black people. About your first week as an officer in Atlanta, when everything you thought you knew got turned upside down. About being scared of making mistakes and then making them anyway. Officer Rodriguez quietly places another document on the judge's desk. This is why Officer Barrett was really transferred here, she says softly. After that night at the community center, he started a program. Every Friday night, he brings officers to play basketball with kids from different neighborhoods. But he does something else too. Judge Thompson unfolds the document, his eyebrows rising as he reads. You have them trade places, he says, looking up at Barrett. The kids put on police gear, and the officers wear regular clothes. You make them walk in each other's shoes. Retired Officer Matthews steps forward, his eyes bright with understanding. Just like what you did with me, Marcus, he says to Judge Thompson. Remember? You made me sit in the library with those law books while students walked past, staring at me like I didn't belong. But there's more to the story. Miss Eleanor enters again, this time with a tablet showing security footage from that morning's checkpoint incident. Judge, she says urgently, you need to see what happened right before Officer Barrett stopped you. The footage plays, revealing something no one in the room expected. Moments before Judge Thompson arrived, Barrett had received a text message. The camera catches him reading it, his hands shaking as he puts away his phone. Judge Thompson pauses the video, looking at Barrett with new understanding. Your daughter, he says quietly. She was in an accident this morning. Barrett's tough exterior finally cracks completely. They said she was hurt bad, he whispers. I couldn't leave my post, but all I could think about was getting to the hospital. When you walked in, looking so confident, so in control, his voice trails off. Judge Thompson stands, removing his robes. Underneath, he's wearing the same kind of ordinary suit Barrett had assumed meant he couldn't really be a judge. Officer Barrett, he says. Life has a way of testing us at our weakest moments. What matters isn't that we stumble, but how we choose to get back up. Then comes the final twist. Marcus's father steps forward with one last revelation. The reason we came here today wasn't just about that basketball program, he says. When we heard about Officer Barrett's daughter, the kids from the community center took up a collection. They've been sitting in the hospital waiting room since dawn, taking turns keeping her company until her father could get there. The room falls silent as Barrett processes this information. Judge Thompson picks up his robes again, but instead of putting them on, he hands them to Barrett. Sometimes, he says, we need to see ourselves through others' eyes to understand our true power, not the power of authority, but the power of human connection. Miss Eleanor appears one last time, her face bright with news. Officer Barrett, your daughter's awake, and she has some visitors. Seems like half the youth basketball league is in her room. They're asking if their favorite referee will make it to tomorrow's game. Barrett looks around the room, at the judge he disrespected, the teenager he'd wrongly accused, the retired officer who'd walked this path before him, and his supervisor who saw his potential beneath his mistakes. In this moment, something shifts fundamentally in how he sees his role in the justice system. Judge Thompson, he says finally, standing straighter but with a new kind of confidence, one built on humility rather than authority, would you do me the honor of coming to tomorrow's game, not as a judge, not as the man I wronged this morning, but as someone who knows better than anyone that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformations. The next afternoon, the Grove Park Community Center buzzes with an energy unlike any other game day. The usual crowd of teenagers and police officers has grown to include courthouse staff, local residents, and even a few other judges who heard about yesterday's events. Judge Thompson arrives early, dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, carrying the same worn leather folder from his chambers. Officer Barrett is already there, his daughter Emily watching from her wheelchair near the court, surrounded by the teenagers who had kept her company at the hospital. The fear and tension from yesterday's courthouse confrontation feel like a distant memory in this sunlit gym filled with laughter and bouncing basketballs. I never thought I'd see this, Officer Matthews says quietly to Judge Thompson as they watch Barrett teaching some kids proper shooting technique. 30 years ago, when I stopped you outside that library, I couldn't have imagined we'd be standing here today. Judge Thompson smiles, opening his folder to share something he'd been saving. Inside is a newspaper clipping from just last week, before the courthouse incident. The headline reads, Local police officers' youth basketball program bridges community divides. The article features a photo of Barrett and Marcus playing basketball with a group of kids, though Barrett hadn't known it was being written. Sometimes, Judge Thompson says, loud enough for Barrett to hear as he approaches, our greatest impact happens when we're not trying to make one at all. He hands the article to Barrett, whose eyes widen in recognition. This is why you were really transferred to our courthouse. The community liaison position was created because of what you started here. Marcus joins them, now wearing a whistle around his neck. He's been helping coach the younger kids in the program. My dad always says that change doesn't happen in courtrooms or police stations, he offers. It happens on basketball courts, in coffee shops, in all the small places where people stop seeing uniforms and start seeing each other. The game begins, but it's unlike any previous match. Judge Thompson and Officer Barrett play on the same team, their previous confrontation transformed into cooperation. Miss Eleanor keeps score, occasionally trading playful banter with Officer Rodriguez, who's refereeing. Even Emily, despite her wheelchair, gets involved, calling out plays and keeping stats. During a water break, Barrett finally shares what was really behind his behavior at the courthouse. When I got that text about Emily's accident, he admits, wiping sweat from his face, all I could think about was losing control. Checking your credentials, Judge Thompson. It was the only control I thought I had left at that moment. Judge Thompson nods understanding. Fear makes us reach for whatever power we think we have, he responds. The challenge is learning to reach for connection instead. The afternoon winds down with an unexpected ceremony. Marcus's father presents both Barrett and Judge Thompson with honorary whistles, symbolizing their new roles as program mentors. But the real surprise comes from Emily, who wheels herself to center court with help from her new teenage friends. When I woke up in the hospital, she says, her voice carrying across the now quiet gym, I was scared and alone. Then these kids showed up. Kids my dad had told me about from his basketball program. They didn't know me, but they stayed. They showed me what my dad's been learning here all along. That community is stronger than fear. As the sun sets outside, casting long shadows through the gym's high windows, Judge Thompson gathers everyone for a final word. He pulls out one last item from his folder, a black and white photo of himself as a young man, standing with Officer Matthews outside that library 30 years ago. Yesterday morning, an officer stopped a judge at a security checkpoint. He begins, his voice resonating with 3 decades of perspective. But what really happened was that 2 human beings had a chance to see past their fear and find something bigger than their badges or robes. Officer Barrett. He turns to face him directly. You've helped create something here that's more powerful than any authority our uniforms give us. Barrett stands a little straighter, but it's a different kind of pride now, not the defensive authority he'd shown at the checkpoint, but the quiet confidence of someone who's found his true purpose. Thank you, Your Honor, he says, then catches himself and smiles. Thank you, Coach. The gymnasium erupts in laughter, and as people begin to gather their things, new connections form naturally. Courthouse staff chat with teenagers about college plans, officers discuss community programs with local parents, and Emily makes plans to help coach the younger kids once her leg heals. Judge Thompson takes one last look around before leaving, watching Officer Barrett lock up the gym with the same care he once used to guard the courthouse entrance. Tomorrow, they'll both return to their official duties, one to the bench, the other to the security checkpoint. But something fundamental has shifted in how they'll see each other and everyone else who passes through those courthouse doors. As Judge Thompson drives home, he thinks about what his grandfather told him on that porch so many years ago. The true measure of a man isn't how he treats those who respect him, but how he responds to those who don't. Today, in a community-centered gym, that wisdom had come full circle, proving that sometimes the greatest victories in justice happen far from any courtroom.